So we can start now. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Guillermina Noël. I am the head of the Design Management International program. And today we are the six authors of a paper that we wrote as part of the Future of Design Education. The paper is called Towards Strengthening Methods in Design Education and Practice, and it was published by the Design Research Society in 2023, Futures with a plural of Design Education. So now I will invite the other panelists to briefly introduce yourself, name and something else you want to share so that we can start this discussion.
Shall I begin since I'm looking now at me there? Okay, my name is Jorge Frascara, as it reads there. I am a visual communication designer, worked at the University of Alberta in Canada for 29 years, and specialized in communications for safety and health.
Thank you.
Who follows?
I can follow. Hi, I'm Paul Gardien. I'm a product designer and then a user interface designer and then a lot of other design disciplines. I worked for a very long time at Philips Design. I was responsible for the research, and now I'm working at the University of Eindhoven.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay, I'm Pieter Stappers. I'm a professor of design techniques at TU Delft. I've been working in design for 40 years now, mainly in education, mainly on methods of research and methods of design, participatory design, co-design, and guiding PhDs in design.
Nice.
Hi, I'm Danielle Rosenberg. I'm currently a professor at San Jose State University here in Silicon Valley. And I've been doing that for a little over a decade. And before that, I spent 30 plus years in the software industry where at one time I was the chief design officer for Oracle and another for SAP. So very software centric career.
Thank you. You are mute, Danielle.
Hi, I'm Danielle Wilde. I am speaking to you from Umeå in the Swedish Arctic. I hold a professorship in Design for Sustainability at Umeå Design School and in Design for Societal Transitions at the University of Southern Denmark in Kolding. And my specialization is embodied ways of knowing and being in the world.
Thank you. So when we started this conversation, I think 3 years ago, one of the concerns was that design practice was changing and the reality designers were facing was different, expanding, more complex. And hence there was a need to rethink about how we were using, teaching, talking about design methods. I have asked each of you to select one point that you thought was the most important in the paper to bring forth so that we can briefly discuss and then open the conversation to the people that joined today. Who would like to start with one of the aspects that you choose from the paper?
Why don't we go in the reverse direction? So the topic I chose is method and ethics for more than human participation in design processes and designing with nature beyond sustainability, materials and function.
Can you elaborate a little bit what is beyond sustainability?
Well, I mean, the reason I talk about beyond sustainability and function is that increasingly designers are working with nature and in the natural environments around us for as far as they exist. But they're also working with biodesign and, developing new materials. And while I think this is really interesting, I think there are ethics to it that aren't necessarily really considered or pulled out. Yes, it's important that we find new materials and as well as new forms for our tables and chairs and clothing and things like that. But I think we also need to think about the ethics of how we as designers are approaching these other living entities that we're co-creating materials and forms with. And it's not a straightforward thing to think about. I think we need to do a bit of work on the methods we're using and how we think about the ethics of what we are doing.
Would you say something very briefly about how you do it when you are teaching?
Very brief, because I'm not teaching into that at the moment. I'm predominantly doing research, but when I have been teaching into that, I actually work with food a lot. Food as a living material for imagining, a material that connects to our cultures and identities and is part of intangible cultural heritage. I at Umeå, where I'm in an industrial design school, we often take the students out into the forest, onto an island, into some of the natural environments that surround us. And I find that while there's a strong desire among the students to be working in new ways, they don't necessarily have the tools to do so. So often they particularly in industrial design, they want to be thinking about new materials and designing in what they think of as sustainable ways, but they don't necessarily have the languaging to do so. And it's not just the vocabulary in the words, but it's also the vocabularies in their making and doing practices and their conceptualizing practices. So there's a lot of new literature that's coming out in this space at the moment. So I tend to bring literature that talks about methods and processes into the classroom and get the students to work in groups and read the material and select a particular method or methods that they will try out in the field and then bring back and try to teach to the other students. So it's a combination of trying to work out how was it useful for us? Did it do what we expected? And can we teach someone else how to do this without just mimicking what the paper said, but bringing some new experiences to it, so that together we can collectively think about what these methods that are being published might actually bring to us in practice.
Thank you. If you want, you can put in the chat one of those sources that you mentioned, if you want.
Okay.
I think that because we go reverse, Daniel, you are next.
Sorry, I have a question, Guillermina. Sorry. Is this being recorded? Because I came late, so I don't know.
Yes, this is being
Yes, okay,
recorded.
great.
Okay, thank you. The topic that I want to focus on today is the intersection of design methods and artificial intelligence. Today, everywhere you go, you get slammed with AI this and AI that. It's kind of unavoidable. But in some ways, it's not a new topic. And I've been engaged in this now for probably the better part of a decade, both from a teaching perspective and mostly from a designing perspective, because I still do consulting types of design, primarily in the medical products area. And the first thing I want to go on record for, and this is covered in the paper, is that there's multiple topics here. The first one is designing the user experience for products that are intelligent and using AI as a media for communication and functional delivery. An example of this it would be in software that does a medical diagnosis and has massive machine learning capability to know every published article about a particular genomic variant, for example. The second area is when we're using AI to design UX. And in this area, there is generative AI that's been demonstrated to support both user experience design, and in one case, a startup that implemented the methodology in my UX Magic book for generative AI. And oh, by the way, they were purchased by IBM last month, so we can talk about that too. But also for user research, there's a lot of expertise and information floating around on how to use generative AI in support of. So once you take a look at those two things, there's just a couple of key points I want to highlight for the from the paper. Number one, this will not replace designers. Number two, as a designer or practitioner in any design profession, you are still responsible for the result. The same way that when AI makes recommendations in a medical product, it is not practicing medicine. It's making a suggestion to a physician who is practicing medicine. But there are always limitations, there's always side effects, and you need to take personal responsibility for that and for any underlying biases that could exist. I will stop talking now, and I'm going to put a link in the chat to hour plus video of a lecture I did at your remotely for your university in Lucerne, where I really explode my thoughts on this whole topic. And I think that's all I'll say for now.
Super, thank you. Pieter Jan or Paul?
Okay.
No,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, the point I'd like to call back from the paper is why we need methods, and there's many of methods is not necessarily that it's prescriptive, but that it gives you a language. And especially because design is increasingly a team effort, not just design teams, but also multi-stakeholder collaborations. You need to have a language to map out what you're trying to do, to align the actions that diverse people take, that they can connect to each other. I remember that or at least I didn't really start very early on design methods, but when I was talking about it with design practitioners, they said there are two main reasons why we need it. One, because we have a team and we need to distribute labor. And if you want to distribute jobs, then you need to be able to talk about that. And the second is you need to be able to itemize items if you want to send a bill. Because if you have a client and you say, I'm going to do a job for you, they need a lot of trust to make that job one single thing. If you can itemize phases or parts, it gives trust in partners. And so I think one of the intriguing things of methods, it's maybe more about how to talk about what you do than it is about what you need to do. That's one aspect of it, which I would like to highlight. Twila, you're very...
Yeah, yeah. I see that Karel has the hand up. We continue or we go for questions? Oh, now it disappeared. Okay, there you go.
Do the round.
Continue. Paul, you are next.
Yeah, I can reinforce what Pieter Jan was saying. I think the process and understanding of the process was really important for the uptake in industry, because that also gave credibility in industry that in the end something useful comes out of all those vague activities. The point I want to emphasize, and we also make that in the papers, that we need to be more specific with our methods. And I think our backgrounds don't help. We are really good in lateral thinking, for instance, but we also have the squirrel syndrome. So when the next shiny thing comes by, then we're looking that way. And I think it's important to be consistent and to stay with the methods for for a while, so that we also can start to prove that they really work. And another thing that doesn't help us there is that we differentiate our work using the methods. So every experience journey that I see looks different, every persona is different, and I think it's important for a discipline that we start to differentiate where it makes sense and standardize where it also makes sense. So I think we need to be more specific with a lot of the tools that we are doing. And what we are trying to do at the university here is implement measurements in experience journeys. And then if you create tooling for that, you also need to be consistent, that you do the same type of measurements in the same consistent way. So I think going forward, it will only become more important.
I would love then after to hear more about the measurement part, but now we move on to Jorge. You are mute.
I know. Okay, there might be some methodological overlap between what one says and what another of the co-authors say, because we were engaged for 3 years in conversations, which is a significant amount of time, not because of much number of hours, but because of the time in between where one keeps on thinking about what was discussed. So my main point is that methods don't solve design projects. Methods help the designer. It's the same that Danielle Rosenberg was saying about AI. For me, the use of methods is like reminders of what I should pay attention to. But then what happens with my tools to understand what I'm paying attention to is a different story, and it depends very much on personal development, values, systems, priorities when working, limited capacity, and so forth. So the paper mentions them also methods as recipes and indicates that those are more useful for the beginning professional, which I agree with. They can be very useful to begin to think methodically. But then later on, one just sees too many nuances in any situation that don't permit the direct transfer, adoption, application, let's say, of any given method. But the critical use of that method will require permanent invention and monitoring. Thank you.
Thank you. And the part that I selected from the paper is a concept from Edgar Morin. And he says that which helps understand how to learn, that is the method. He said, I do not offer the method. I go in search of the method. And I think that that is a key skill that the designer needs to have. First, acknowledging the uncertainty at the beginning of the design process and the not knowing, and the idea of the design process as something that is evolving, and hence you don't know what might be the next method that you need in order to understand the situation that you are facing and proceed with that in whatever stage of the design process it might be. So this relates to the idea of the design process as a constant learning process, which was something that Jean-Christophe Jean proposed in 1970. And so it's quite old idea of my age, but for some reason it's still not fully discussed or acknowledged in the teaching of design. So I think that that's a very important aspect to take. So now we can open to questions from the public to our participants. Let us see, you can talk. We can, if you raise the hand like Karel did, we can unmute. You can write in the chat, or I don't know if the questions and answer is active. So 3 options: raise hand, write in the chat. Oh, there is something already in the questions and answer. Great. Isabel asks, are you aware that the chat is disabled? There you go. No, I'm not aware. And we would like to share the link to the paper. Yes, I can share the link to of the paper. And as well, that talk that Daniel Rosenberg was referring to. So the link that Daniel Rosenberg was referring to, I can also put it in the chat. I understand that he already did,
Yeah.
but I don't know if,
But if the chat is disabled for them, I think what
yeah.
they're saying is they can't see it because I also put a link in
But
there.
I think that if you click everyone, I can copy. I can copy the links that we already shared, and I can put it to everyone. And now I will put the link of the paper. And in the meanwhile, if we have questions, and
But it seems that so far only the panelists can see the chat.
I copy the links for everyone. So hopefully everyone, can someone make a sign if you are getting the links? I put the link of the paper too.
The chat panel that I see says it's going to both host and panelists. But
Yes, and I click, and below it says everyone. I don't know if you have access to that too.
Yeah, you
maybe
can see it in the chat, Guillermina, that it goes to everyone.
Okay.
Maybe it doesn't.
Okay, they've just said in the chat that they can see the links now. It's just that most of us can't access them, but
Yeah.
Guillermina can.
Yeah, we can see the link. There is a question by Jose Antonio, and he said, Frank Gehry recommend always ask the client why they want to do what they were asking to do. Do you think the why is a good start point to begin a designing anything?
yes.
I actually want to give an example that I saw today in a talk by Eric Sanderlin. So hi, Eric, if you're out there. He's visiting Umeå at the moment. And he was using he provided an example of a design studio in France that was asked to redesign a square, and they did a really complex evaluation. They came back and they said, well, our recommendation is do nothing, maybe clean it up a little bit, just take care of the ongoing daily maintenance of the space a bit better, but don't redesign anything. And so there are a number of different examples of work like that, and I think you can see them in Eric's PhD, Design and Grace, which he just finished at Constfac, where he goes through and looks at, what does it mean when design steps back and does nothing rather than always assuming that we have to do something. And I guess to arrive at that, the why is a pivotal question to ask.
Go ahead.
Me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. This reminds me of, I don't know who said it, but it was one of the early books on service design. They said earlier designers would ask the client, what do you want? After that, it became, what do you need? The next step is, what are you trying to do? And that's even further than asking, why are you asking this? It's actually delving into the broader context of the client, of their endeavors, and trying to help make an improvement there, but not starting from what the solution is supposed to be or what the qualities of the solution are. Of course, those could be great conversation starters, but that's what a brief is. It's a conversation starter.
And for my money, that's what why is trying to find out. Why are you asking for this? What's going on underneath it?
I think it's the same goal, but the why still gives primary importance of that first hunch. So if I say, I want a chair, why do you want a chair? Because it's in our product portfolio, and it's that might not actually be the best solution direction. But I think it's not particularly how you phrase it, but it's the exploration of the relation between what the project starts with, what the client comes with, and what the designer can do has broadened up a lot. And it also become more contextual and more interactive.
I wrote yes, and not only. So for me, working in healthcare, the question that I usually ask is, what is a situation that requires care? And then there are many situations that follow. So not only what is taking place, but when does it take place? And you might ask, why does it take place? But when, where, who is involved? So there are many questions. But for me, the first question is, what is the situation that requires care? The second question will be, how do you know? How do you know that that is the situation? And usually the answer will be because we have data. And then I start seeing what kind of data there is and what is the data indicating. And usually it's quantitative data. Danielle.
Was that me? Yeah. I have so much to say about data. It will bore everyone to tears, but I think the only thing that I'll say, which is something that many people forget, we have a tendency to treat data as truth, but when data is numerical, in particular, because data can take so many forms, but in particular when it's numerical, but you know, data is what the particular instrument you're using happens to have captured at the location and moment then you used it, not more and not less. So because we accord this data some kind of truth, we often forget that it's including all of these other things that might be just as or perhaps even more important than what that particular instrument is able to capture.
Yeah, the data is quite complex. And you were talking about ethics before. Ethics is always behind the data. Danielle, Danielle.
I wanted to agree with Danielle and just point out that the famous American novelist and author Mark Twain, for 100 years ago, said, there are lies, damn lies, and statistics.
Mhm.
And that's what it is. You see the numbers, and they're full of bias.
I would like to add something to Danielle's statements. Um, I would say that data without context is no information. And what you were saying, Danielle, reminds me of that because you were talking about the specificity of each situation, so that I cannot assume that the data I am reading belongs to a situation that I imagine. If there is no description of the situation, those numbers cannot mean absolutely anything to me.
I think we covered
Particularly
this
when you
in
are,
the
sorry,
paper as well. We cover this point that the understanding context and being very careful to not transfer context in design situations is an important skill to learn. And
mhm,
everything has to be validated and verified.
yeah.
But I
We have,
think data also has the thing, just like actually prior art and theory, we can build on things that have been gathered before, but we run the risk of extending the biases that were before. So, what are the things about which there is a lot of data? There's a lot of data about elements where someone sought a lot of profit. So that, I mean, take all the medicines, there are much more data and research for possible diseases where there are potential pharmaceutical cures for people who can afford to buy those things. There's a lot of data there because someone paid for the gathering of data. So data is a something that is constructed, and you should be aware of the history by which it was made.
We have another question by Jose Antonio, and he says, what do you think about the concept of warm data of Nora Basin to use it in the design field? I admire Nora Basin a lot. I don't think that warm data is a research method. I think that is something different, but I don't know if someone else can answer about that. My
No,
understanding is that warm data will not help you to design something. It's something different. Paul.
no, I think that comes out of the Bateson discussion, the warm data, but I'm also not so really sure what is what is warm data. But I think the point connected to what Pieter Jan was saying, like bias is one, but being in the moment, so the contextual the timing element of contextual is also really important. So that you, and a lot of the tools we have, questionnaires are all after the hours or even days or weeks after the fact. So I think we need to try to be more in the moment with our data gathering, and also understanding the relations that are going on while we gather that data. And I think that's also part of the warm element.
I want to add to that if I can. I completely agree that it's about capturing relationships and complexities. But what I wanted to speak to has now just completely escaped me. I'll come back to it. Sorry.
Michaela wrote, warm data is a storytelling experience, sharing stories and make experience of complexity. So I
know what I wanted to say. I wanted to say two things. So I really wanted. Oh my God, it's gone again. Oh, I'm terribly sorry. It's completely gone. I don't know what happened. Excuse me.
No problem. So I based on what Michaela is sharing, I still think that it's not a research method, and I'm not sure if someone else have used it as a research method.
I think that is an invitation to pay attention to the fluidity of events. It's more like acknowledging the existence of permanent change, which sets a frame to be careful when one looks at something at a frozen moment in time, as you were saying, Danielle, a specific moment, a specific place, and a specific situation. Just that. So it's something like saying, be aware, these things are alive and they move all the time. So just be aware that whatever conclusion you get from something, it might be subject to change and mutation.
I would say it's not a method, but it's something to be aware of as you are selecting your methods, as you are designing. I've remembered what I was going to say is something else that I think is critically important is being aware of where you put the boundaries around your area of concern. So we can't design for the entire universe every time we try to imagine something and try to make something in the world. Be it tangible or conceptual. We need to put boundaries around our kind of thought space or area of concern. And this is another thing that if we are aware that we're doing that and we take into account that we're cutting off a whole lot of relations, we're stopping here. We're stopping here so that we can actually work, so that we can actually do something, so that we can apply our methods or select methods or determine what the step forward are. But as we do that, it's just critically important to be present to the fact that everything is complex, everything is in relation, that what really exists is arguably the gaps between things rather than the things themselves, which is a whole philosophical conversation beyond the scope of this talk. But nonetheless, if we stay attentive to that, attentive to the complexities and relations that warm data speaks about, then I think we can be a bit more caring, has been brought up, a bit more humble in our designing, maybe. We can be present to the limitations of what we are offering, that it's situated in space and time, and it's only accounting for, a certain amount of the complexity that we are swimming in.
There's another comment by Michela, and she said, I am a warm data host, and I can say that it is a spontaneous research approach. So I think that with this, we can wrap up the part of warm data. Hopefully the public have more questions for us, but in the meanwhile, my question to you panelists is, what are the challenges you face when teaching design methods, both at the undergraduate and graduate level?
Ownership. Ownership, being able to reach the meta level above executing a procedure, and gaining experience, and being able to select your tools appropriate to the endeavor that you're trying. I think it's an easy start. Maybe it's the best start to execute an algorithm, to make your first recipe, to make your first dish, but then you need to go beyond that. And I think one of the best things we had in our education at the end of the first year, and I think that was 30 years of education we had, that at the end of the first year, students would have to make in a team their own barbecue set. Paul, you did, right?
Yeah,
At the end of that first year, so these teams of students, then they would have to eat from it, and you burnt your hands and you suffered the consequences of your design mistakes, and you reflected in a very painful way, a very enlightening way, what could have been done different. And I think that learning from the confrontation that you could have done things different, and there might be many ways to do things different, and how to get on, which variation will you try next. I think that's one of the key lessons. You'll never get that without hands-on experience.
I would add, in my experience, the key limitation is sufficient time, because when you teach, you can explain the purpose of a method, the theory, the recipe. You can give an exercise in class, but that would be a very dumbed down, short exercise, and you don't get that real deep reflection. And then you can ask and require students to use that method as part of an ongoing project, but still now there's a big time gap between when they're struggling with it and getting feedback. And so time either too much between execution and reflection, or time too little to really even do something of sufficient complexity to incorporate and embody and intellectualize the practice. And so that's the struggle, because there's not an infinite amount of time.
Yeah.
Semester or in a class session.
There is another question and it says, how would you personally say can mindfulness practice support methods in design and enable designers to approach complex challenges? I can answer that one. I think that the word I will use is the importance of awareness. And I think that when doing research, one is the instrument. So you need to be very much aware about what do you have how are you sensing? I was going to say what you have in your head, but not just in your head. So how are you sensing? How are you um, listening, seeing all beyond the five senses that we were taught we have? Because you need to understand, particularly when collecting and interpreting data, what are you interpreting? And it might be that you have is your big bias interpreting. And so you need to constantly wonder why is this? So engaging in meditation can help you become aware of what you have in your head and hence interpret why you are saying that that's the case of what is taking place. That would be my answer. And I usually teach in the second year research some sessions with a Buddhist monk that support the students in the teaching of awareness practices. Danielle, you were going to say something.
I was. When I moved to Denmark 10 years ago to introduce embodied design into the existing Masters of Participatory Innovation. And there are two things that come up for me as major challenges, and it's related to the mindfulness question, but it's also related to the learning by failing question. So coming back to one of the biggest challenges, getting students to actually understand that working with their embodied ways of knowing, not just their intellect, but working intuitively, trusting their senses. I mean, we have senses to sense the world so that we can make meaning from what we are sensing. But the dominant paradigm is that, well, that's all nice and well, and this is lots of fun, and isn't what we did, just fabulous. That was terrific, and the design work that came out of it was great. But now we want a job, so we need to be clever. And so there's a big challenge with supporting students to understand that working in embodied ways, thinking through moving, making, and doing can actually really make a difference to their design output and can be appreciated by industry when they want jobs in industry. And the other thing, just quickly, is that you need to take risks now. It's really hard to be fired as a student. So if you practice taking risks and practice being really wild in your imagining and your creating and learn how to critically engage with what happens when you do that, you will build your capacity for, being brave as a designer and your capacity to understand how to learn from failure, so that when you get into industry, if that's where you're heading, or when you get into whatever professional context you're going to, you will be much better at trusting your creative processes and finding new things that are surprising for you, rather than only trying to go towards what you think is a clever thing to go towards.
I'd
Yeah,
like to
I think
challenge
still,
but-
yeah,
oh,
go ahead, Daniel.
Oh, okay, thank you. So this whole question about learning to fail, in my opinion, is a myth. And here in Silicon Valley, fail early, fail often is a common thing you hear as the mantra. And it's really not valid. Even in the startup industry, you fail early and you fail often, you run out of money. Your company fails to exist. You do not go forward. And in many areas, there is no failing forward. I design medical products. We don't fail forward by seeing how many people die with each iteration of the product, even when it's in clinical trial, and that's a big risk. So I think we need to be careful. We learn by trying to do things and realizing and being shown through constructive criticism that we could have done better. Okay, but that's not the same thing as failing. So we need to be careful, because I simply kind of reject the premise of the question.
Well, can I jump into that? Because I think the origin of the urging people to fail early and often, uh, or to try, fail and fail and fail again, but always getting better a bit, is originally, I think, from don't spend too long just theorizing. Get your hands dirty early. Build an early prototype if you have your idea instead of building the whole thing. In software construction, I think with Agile, there's get a minimal working thing working so you can actually engage with the complexity. So there, I think it's not meant to be failing, like killing yourself or chop your hands off or something like that, but engage in the confrontation of where you need to make success. And I think
right.
that's something we probably agree on.
I do agree, but iterating forward and finding that you did not fully achieve whatever the goal was, even for an MVP, isn't inherently encouraging people to fail. It's encouraging them to experiment and to be cognizant of the results of that experiment.
To take risks.
Yeah, but I think probably it wasn't a good choice of words back then.
The language. Jorge.
Yes, thank you. I will put the failure success in a different kind of context. When you design medical device that serves to do very high risk interventions on the human body is one thing. As I worked in communications in traffic safety, it's very difficult to say this has failed, this has succeeded. It's always relative. And like my framework was a certain percentage of reduction of injury was obtained in these several countries after an intervention whose teeny-weeny details I cannot know. But there has been some kind of standard response found. And I can then say, okay, the work that I did in Ghana is not too bad, but it's not too good either. And it's always going to move that way. They say, I cannot say, oh, I failed because I didn't get the 30% reduction that Spain got or Norway got. Given the conditions where I was working, 19% reduction sounded satisfying. But I just think whenever you are looking at a social situation, like a friend that was working on family violence in Manaus, Brazil, there was a result, there was an outcome. Was it the best possible? Is there any word that you can compare how good it was? But it's always a degree to which the objective was obtained. It's not fail or succeed.
Isabel was saying, I'm currently conducting research into mindfulness practice as a vital support for co-creation for social change. Pieter Jan, you are the person that wrote about co-creation. So I don't know if you want to say some comment about that. And Isabel, I don't know if you have specific questions about that.
I can say something about it, but I think one of the interesting things of co-creation is that you want to bring out people's strengths. And for that, many things have been tried. And so techniques of mindfulness, yeah, techniques of embodiment, yeah. It's really a broad spectrum of techniques that you can use. And maybe just naming one ingredient is not a guaranteed success, because a single ingredient doesn't make the success. But many techniques have been proven to bring about successful interactions of people. Some of the things to bring out co-creation, have dinner together. Well, why? Is it about feeding people? No, it's about a certain way of social engagement with people, which brings out their expertise more. So, yeah, mindfulness, sure.
Mikel asks, how can we prepare the designer mindset approach, not technical but personal? I am interested in the participants observer mindset. We have to observe and participate in the context in this at the same time. Yeah, that's a constant think that by now we know the observing itself in the context of doing research. For me, two authors that outline this very well are Maturana and Varela. I think that's both of them have questioned science and the way to do science, bringing the attention of the first person perspective when doing research. I don't know if someone else wants to add something to that.
What I try to do in my teaching is using the iceberg model that's also used in surface design. So linking values to procedures to observable behaviors. And I think there it also links to methods. So you need to pick the methods that you also that help you reaching the values, and there will be processes or procedures in between that will help you reaching those values. So I'm trying to link values, procedures or processes, and actually activities. And when you start to think about it in that iceberg model, it often helps the students.
Great. We have comment by Jorge Hirter. He says there seems to be a large overlap if tools and methods across different disciplines. How do methods used in design differ from those of other disciplines? I'm often challenged by my students to apply what makes them unique and different from professionals in other disciplines. So who goes for that one?
I can go first. I think that there are certain capacities that are human and appear in many disciplines. And the capacity to observe, the capacity to analyze, the capacity to recognize the differences between contexts, the capacity to quantify when it is appropriate to quantify, the capacity to see nuances when it is not, and it has to do with human behavior, for instance. And then there is knowledge domain that belongs to a different discipline. I'm not an engineer. I cannot estimate how much cement I need to support a roof. So that pertains to building engineers. And then there is, I'm not an electronic engineer either. I cannot pretend to be. I am a designer that works on communications, fundamentally visual communications. And I have some knowledge of how to produce objects that do the work they are supposed to do. But the basic mental capacities and methods of thinking that I use can be recognized in clinical doctors, in gardeners, in all kinds of other disciplines. And so it's not totally unique. What my discipline gives me is only a parcel of knowledge that I possess, and other disciplines have their own.
I'd like to add to what Jorge just said. The way I view this, particularly in the world of design, is there's a plurality of valid decisions that could be and outcomes that can be successful in design. There's not one answer. And our methods are different in that regard, that I can give the same design project to different students and get equally valid results that are somewhat dissimilar. However, in many disciplines, the method is structured to come up with a single answer, right? The minimum amount of steel to hold an airplane in the sky, the minimum amount of concrete to hold a building up, right, for economic reasons, or the method of particular surgery. We don't really want people doing innovations in the main practice in surgery. There is research in surgery to try and develop alternative methods. But generally, you would say there's really one answer that you're trying to get to, one optimized answer. We don't have that in design. Plurality of valid solutions occurs all the time. And that is the main difference that I see between design as a discipline and many engineering disciplines.
I want to connect to that because I think it's not just plurality of solutions, it's also plurality of perspectives. The term discipline typically refers to one particular highly polished lens through which we look at a part of a thing. And designers have the job of looking at all the parts, all the possible perspectives. And actually, Hammack says that of engineers in general, that they are stepping beyond what's already known, whereas the sciences go for understanding what is already owned. And I like that a lot. If you have a problem situation, bring in a psychologist. Psychologists can say, well, yeah, there's a problem there, but it's not a psychology problem. I won't take someone else. And you bring in a sociologist and he can say the same. People from a narrow discipline or from a specific discipline can always say, oh, yeah, that's not my problem. Designers actually have to say, I'll see what I can do, taking in all of that. And I remember one of the funniest thing we were engaged with bringing elements of design education to primary and secondary education. And one of the biggest problems for teachers there is that in all the courses in secondary education, except maybe music and physical education, the correct answers are in the teacher's handbook appendix. All the sums are listed in the student's handbook, and at the back, for the teacher, there are the correct answers. And then if they had to do things with design, the correct answers were not specified, which is scary if you're not used to that. That takes, that takes some experience.
It also makes it hard to be a design professor because when you assign projects to students, and I do projects that are actually sponsored by companies, you don't actually know even how to grade it, because you're not an expert in the field either.
I'd like to add to this discussion and coming back to the question, how do methods used in design differ from those of other disciplines? And sometimes the methods are shared or sometimes they're borrowed from other disciplines, but it's the ways that they are implemented or the ways that designers are able to think about how they can be implemented that often differs. I mean, if we think about something as simple as the interview, we can learn a lot from architecture, we can learn a lot from feminist studies, we can learn a lot from the social sciences where they're doing interviews as forms of walking with and all kind of different ways. But even if we stick with design, immediately there are so many different ways that the interview can be thought about. And I mean, just at the foundation, one of the things that I think design brings that is so strong that is not really brought by other disciplines is using tangibles within interviews as ways to think. So using other design methods to develop things that can support people in engaging in other kinds of thinking processes and other kinds of seeing processes. And I think design's really good at that. So maybe our methods on the surface might be shared by many other disciplines, but the ways that we do them as designers, I think, brings something really important to the conversation and to what's able to be achieved with methods.
Yeah.
A tactical example of that is the jobs to be done method, which is classic business school and was really oriented on how to make money, how to fill a vacuum, in terms of what your company or brand delivers. And designers have many designers have adopted the jobs to be done, but it's, in this case, all about the how, not the what. So we think it's the same method, but it's actually 10 different uses. That same method have been documented in Greg Kalbach's book on the topic.
I was going to say that I agree. I think you, Jorge, highlighted this, that ways of knowing are human ways of knowing, but I think that it is in the creative inquiry aspect of a designer. This relates to what Danielle was saying. Maybe we combine prototypes with interviews to help people imagine the situation of using something during an interview, or we ask them to create a scenario while interviewing. And I think that is this creative aspect of thinking what will help this person imagine in this situation, what will help this person remember, what will help this person communicate, being orally or in a written way, or by pointing or whatever way, what they have in mind, and how this that they have in mind can be used to better understand what will help them.
I want to just follow on from that. I'm thinking about Mary Carida's master's thesis that was published after she got her PhD in a journal, and I'll put the link in there. And what Mary did, and this is what other disciplines don't generally do, is, for example, she did a study with people wearing Fitbits and found ways to have them engage with their data. But in some of her experiments, she used watercolor paper and asked people to graph out their feelings on a particular day using very watery paint on watercolor paper. So it was completely uncontrollable. And it was the uncontrollability of it that led them to say, oh, no, it's not like that. Actually, this is what I wanted to do. And then it allowed very different kinds of discussions to take place. And I think this is something that design is willing to do in our methods. We're willing to foreground or leverage creativity and fruitful disruption and methods that maybe undo someone's composure and undo their certainty, so that they can actually maybe experiment with new positions on what you're trying to find out.
And it's an undoing with care, right? So that the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. It was this notion of fruitful disruption. It's like you're undoing, but you're undoing in ways that, at least in the work that I'm familiar with, leverages delight or surprise, or it can be discomfort, but not a discomfort that feels unsafe. It's being in a space where you can disrupt positioning to support people to think in new ways.
The answers point to, I think we have a specific lens, and that is end users or people, and now end users in the broader sense, with more than human, and activities of those end users or subjects. And I think a lot of other disciplines, architecture is not really involved with how people live in their buildings, if I'm black and white, and I think also the other disciplines not. So I think we have a very specific lens that we also need to take care for and keep on pushing. Otherwise, we get in co-create and we do everything and we help everybody and we use everybody's tools. But I think we need to keep on focusing on our specific lens also.
I don't know if we have more questions from the public. Otherwise, I can ask a question to those teaching PhDs. What is that you expect when a PhD candidate develop the methods for the thesis, or propose how to go about dealing with a complex situation?
That's a very broad subject. The
I'm
PhD.
not teaching PhD, so luckily that one passes me.
Oh, I have been, and we've shared experiences from several universities in Docs for Design. And it's a universal requirement for a PhD candidate to have done original research, which means do research means generate knowledge for use by others. And some will generate knowledge about a new method.
Mhm.
Some will just use design methods to generate insights. It's also good. Um, but how they do it, luckily that's not prescribed. I think the PhD is a level which is super disciplinary. Although at many places you can become a PhD in this or a PhD in that. But if you're pushing the boundaries, you may actually be well off to not be bound to the confines of a single discipline. That being said, if you are building on design skills during your PhD, you find that traditional ways of presenting rigor of research is established in other disciplines more readily at hand, and it is more varied and less prescribed, but therefore also more under expert judgment, which again depends on individuals and their expertise and their judgment in design. So there's not a single simple answer, but on the other hand, there ought to be quite some freedom. But the thing is, how can you convincingly argue for the validity of the things you do? And yes, you can do that with a method, but if you want to exhaustively try out a method rather than just try something out for one time, so that can be sure about the framing and the reasons behind and the generalizability, applicability for others, oh, that's not an easy thing.
I have a very limited supervision of PhD experience. I always did it as a co-supervisor for somebody in design and another discipline. And what I found is that normally my PhD student will know more than I about the topic that they are working on, which is natural because I think that one thing is to supervise on PhD, another thing is to teach an undergraduate. There's no that much teaching in the PhD situation. I think that there's a lot of co-participation in the development of new knowledge, and that my function was that of making sure that the person was clear about what they wanted to get and clear about the steps that were necessary to get something reliable. But it's a very participatory situation in the development of the thesis, in my experience. There will be other disciplines where, as we were saying, the knowledge is more limited and it can be possessed by the prof and then help the student go through the corridors of that knowledge. But I found that actually, for me, it was very interesting to work with PhD students because I ended up learning some things that I didn't know before. And same was true for them.
Thank you.
I love working with PhD students. I really love it. It's a journey that I feel very privileged to accompany them on. For my money, there are two things that I want to say. One is I think while PhDs may not all bring a contribution in terms of method, I think PhDs in design inevitably, and this may not be the case in engineering, but in the forms of design that I engage with, design research, they always bring a methodological contribution. And we had a discussion over lunch today about, what is methodology? How do we understand it in different languages? It doesn't translate to simply one word the way that it's used in English, and how can we think about it? And I always describe a methodology as the logic behind which methods you use and why you use those and not other ones, and how you use them and why you use them in that way and not in other ways. And that's your methodology. It's not simple perhaps to explain, but if it's understood in that way as the logic behind what you're doing, I think it's helpful. And because design is such a situated discipline, in the sense that we act in the world, whether we act tangibly or conceptually, we're acting in the world, we're world building in one way or another, then the work is very situated. And when you apply a method anywhere at all, it's in a context, and the collision between the method and the context gives rise to new knowledges. And therefore I think when you discuss your methodology within the context of a PhD, there and actually I think in many design research articles there's a methodological contribution. It's just a question of whether the researcher is able to bring forward that contribution and able to highlight it, or whether that particular paper warrants bringing it forward. But in a PhD, I think it does warrant bringing it forward. The one other thing I wanted to say is that as a supervisor, I can't remember, it may have been one of my supervisors who proposed this to me, and I really liked the idea that as a supervisor, you're like a tugboat who's just making sure that the candidate, it's their steam that takes them forward. But the job of the supervisor is just to make sure they don't go off track. Mm-hmm. And so how do you help them to make sure they will arrive where they need to arrive in time? How do you help them to see the things that maybe they're not seeing, or that maybe they can benefit from seeing from another perspective, to help ensure that they're just continuing to go in the right direction with the right kind of level of propulsion, in the sense that, sometimes stopping and being still is important. Sometimes going off track is important, so long as you understand that this is perhaps a divergence. So either the direction you're heading may need to change, or you may need to come back to that kind of direction you were heading in, so you need to think about these things. But it's this sort of process of just making sure they don't go too far off track, and that they're aware when they are, making divergences, so that they can think critically about the impact of that.
Very nice way of explaining the role of the supervisor. I don't know if we have more questions. If we don't have more questions, do you have comments to make?
I just want to say I put Mary's paper, which I'm a co-author on, about her master's thesis that I spoke about. I put the link to that in the chat, but I don't know if it got through. I answered kind of a random question. So
yes,
I can see it.
Yeah.
I
think it was very enjoyable. Thank you very much to everybody.
Yes.
But I have nothing else to add at this point. If maybe somebody has. You, Guillermina, did you get what you wanted to get?
I think it was a very nice discussion, very juicy. And I think that a lot of people will be reflecting tonight about the methods and the use of methods to get us to know what's taking place in reality.
I'd like to make a comment. First of all, for those in the participants who are here present, if you haven't read the paper, I would be very interested that you read it, and perhaps continue this discussion, and keep in mind that this is the outcome of, as was said at the beginning, 3 years of regular discussion, and it's so this paper is like the tip of the iceberg of the things that we spoke about, and trying to wrangle the things we were speaking about into a form that could kind of communicate the essential within, the format that's required by the publication venue. So there are so many things that are just mentioned in a moment, or perhaps just with a reference, but actually took up a lot of our reflection time and consideration, and that we considered important. But in the final paper, it just ends up, as a single line, because, we tried to wrangle, this really rich conversation that I feel really privileged to have been part of.
To close, I would like to read the last sentence of the paper of the conclusion. And it says, eventually, when designers use supporting methods, accepting uncertainty, not knowing, avoiding the simplification of realities, what should emerge is a transformation, not only of the reality confronted, but of the designers themselves. And I think that if that happens, then you are pretty sure you did a good job. So I put the quote here in the chat. You can find it on page 12. And thank you very, very much to everyone, panelists and attendees, for joining us today in this discussion.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.